took the job because I'd run out of places that would answer my calls. The budget fraud investigation in Atlanta hadn't touched me directly. That didn't matter. I'd worked in the same office, reported to the same director, and when the auditors finished, every name on that floor went into a file somewhere. 3 months of savings. No callbacks. I sent applications to places I wouldn't have looked at a year earlier, and Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa was the first one that said yes. I didn't read the facility history carefully. I knew it was old. I knew it had a reputation. But needing income and being unable to afford scrutiny made every decision after that feel like the only one I could make. The night shift intake coordinator position paid $31,000 a year. I signed the contract on a Tuesday and started that Friday. The admissions office sat just inside the main entrance, a narrow room with 2 desks, a row of filing cabinets, and a window that looked out at the employee parking lot. The day shift coordinator, a woman named Teresa Marsh, met me at the door on my first night and walked me through the basics. She was maybe 50, short, with graying hair and reading glasses on a chain. She wore a blue blouse and slacks, and she moved through the office with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same job for a decade. "You'll handle walk-ins, transfers, and court orders," she said, tapping a stack of blank intake forms on the desk. "Most nights it's quiet. Sometimes you'll get 2 or 3, depends." I nodded. "Digital system? Day shift, yes." She gestured to the computer on the far desk. "Night shift still runs on paper." I looked at the filing cabinets. "Why?" "Server failure back in 2019, she said. "Wiped 6 months of records. They set up a workaround and never reversed it." "So I log everything by hand?" "Correct." She opened the top drawer and pulled out a leather-bound log, the kind you'd see in a hotel from 40 years ago. Date, time, patient name, intake coordinator signature. At the end of your shift, you leave it on my desk. I transfer it to the system in the morning. I flipped through the log. The handwriting changed every few pages. Some entries were neat. Others were barely legible. "What if something doesn't transfer?" I asked. She looked at me over her glasses. "It transfers." I set the log back on the desk. "Got it." She showed me the rest, where the blank forms were kept, how to file completed intakes, the phone list for on-call physicians, the cabinet with the lockbox for patient valuables. It was all straightforward, the kind of procedural walkthrough I'd done a dozen times in other facilities. "Questions?" she asked. "I don't think so." "Good." She picked up her purse from the desk and slung it over her shoulder. "Your supervisor is Clyde Morris. He'll check in once or twice a night. If you need anything, his extension is on the list." "Okay." She paused at the door. "One more thing. Don't leave the office unattended. If you need to step away, call Morris first." "Understood." She left. I sat down at the desk and opened the log to a blank page. The first night was quiet. No walk-ins, no transfers. I spent most of it reading through old intake forms, learning the rhythm of how things were documented. Around 2 a.m, a man in a rumpled button-down shirt and a supervisor's lanyard stopped by the office. He was maybe late 40s, heavy-set, with thinning dark hair and a face that looked tired in a permanent kind of way. "You're Soto," he said. "Yeah, Clyde Morris." He didn't offer his hand. "How's it going?" "Quiet." "It will be." He glanced at the log on my desk. You get a transfer. Make sure the court order matches the name on the form. If it doesn't, call me before you file it. Got it. He turned to leave, then stopped. You meet Ray yet? Ray? Graham, hospital chaplain. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Only person in this building who'll tell you the truth about anything. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Morris left. I wrote down his name in the margin of my notepad, next to Ray Graham, and underlined it twice. A warning, probably, or a recommendation. I wasn't sure which. I met Ray Graham 3 days later in the break room. It was around midnight. I'd stepped away from the desk to grab coffee, and he was sitting at the small table near the window, reading a book with a cracked leather cover. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with close-cropped, silver-streaked hair and dark skin. He wore a clerical collar and a dark vest, and when he looked up, his eyes were calm in a way that made me feel like I was interrupting something. Sorry, I said. Didn't mean to. You're fine. He closed the book and set it on the table. You're the new intake coordinator. Lance Soto. Ray Graham. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit if you want. I poured the coffee and sat down. The book on the table had text in a language I didn't recognize, and the cover was so worn I couldn't make out the title. What are you reading? I asked. He glanced at the book. Kebra Nagast, Ethiopian text. Pre-Christian mostly. What's it about? He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how much to explain. A lot of things. Kings, lineages, angels. He paused. There's a section near the end about an entity that doesn't operate the way people expect. I sipped the coffee. How so? It doesn't follow sin, he said. It follows grief. Unresolved grief, specifically. The kind that weighs on a person even when they don't talk about it. And it does what? It announces its selection, he said, by appearing in the target's image, reflective surface, recorded surface, somewhere the person will see themselves and know it isn't them. I set the cup down. That's dark. It is. You believe it? He looked at me with those calm, steady eyes. I believe people carry weight they don't name, and I believe some places make that weight visible. I didn't know what to say to that. So I finished the coffee, thanked him, and went back to the admissions office. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the shift. Not because I believed in entities or pre-Christian folklore, but because Morris had told me Ray was the only person who'd tell the truth, and Ray had just told me something that sounded like a warning dressed up as a story. I filed it away. Institutional folklore. The kind of thing people tell each other in old buildings to make the night shift feel less empty. On the third night, a patient arrived by transfer. It was just after 1 a.m. I heard the van pull up outside, and a minute later, 2 county deputies walked a man through the front entrance. He was maybe 40, average height, pale, with dark eyes that didn't blink as much as they should have. He wore standard patient clothing, and his hands were cuffed in front of him. One of the deputies handed me a manila envelope. Transfer from Taylor Hardin. Court orders inside. I opened the envelope and pulled out the paperwork. The patient's name was listed as Gregory, no middle name, no last name, just Gregory. The court order had a case number at the top, but the diagnosing physician field was blank. I looked up. There's no physician listed. The deputy shrugged. That's what they gave us. I can't file this without a physician's signature. Call your supervisor, he said. We've got 2 more stops tonight. I picked up the phone and dialed Morris's extension. He answered on the second ring. Yeah. It's Soto. I've got a transfer from Taylor Hardin. Court orders missing a diagnosing physician. There was a pause. Taylor Hardin? Yeah. Don't query it, he said. Just initial the field and file the form. Initial it? Yeah. Put your initials in the physician field and file it. I'll handle the rest in the morning. I looked at the blank line on the form. You sure? I'm sure. His voice was flat. File it. He hung up. I set the phone down and looked at the deputies. They were already halfway to the door. I picked up the pen and initialed the blank physician field. Then I signed my name at the bottom of the form, logged the intake in the paper ledger, and filed the paperwork in the cabinet. The whole thing took less than 3 minutes. It felt in that moment like the only sensible thing to do. I finished the paperwork and went to make my rounds. Ward C was on the east side of the building. 3 locked doors between the main corridor and the patient rooms. I had a key ring with 8 keys on it, and I still had to check the labels every time. The first door opened into a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and something else underneath it. Something older. The lights were fluorescent and they hummed. I could hear them even when I wasn't paying attention. Gregory's room was the 3rd one on the left. I stopped outside the door and looked through the observation window. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, with his hands folded in his lap. Not moving, just sitting there. I checked the log clipped to the wall. Last check was at midnight. Miranda Crane's handwriting, everything normal. I was about to move on when he started talking. His voice was flat. No inflection, just words in a sequence. Harriet Odom, Charles Lee Whitmore, Sandra Jean Pruitt. I stopped. Michael Anthony Delgado, Raymond Foster, Alice Mae Turnbull. I looked through the window again. He hadn't moved. His mouth was open, but his face didn't change. Dorothy Ann Kessler, William James Harding, Lucille Beatrice Stone. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds. He kept going, name after name, full names, middle names included. I walked back to the admissions office and pulled the deceased patient log from the filing cabinet. It was a thick binder, alphabetical order, cross-referenced by date of death. I flipped to the O section. Harriet Odom, died March 4th, 2018. I checked the next name. Charles Lee Whitmore, died March 9th, 2018. Sandra Jean Pruitt, March 14th. He wasn't reciting them alphabetically. He was reciting them in order of death. I sat there with the binder open on the desk. The fluorescent light overhead was flickering a little. I could hear it clicking. I figured maybe he'd gotten access to a log somehow. Maybe someone had left it in his room by mistake. It seemed unlikely, but not impossible. I went back to Ward C at 3 a.m. For the second check. He was still sitting on the bed. Same position, hands folded, mouth moving. Ernest Lloyd Baxter, Vivian Rose Kemp, Theodore Franklin Moss. I checked the log again. Same names, same order. I stood there watching him through the window. He didn't blink, didn't look up, just kept going. Margaret Eloise Hahn, Robert Samuel Nix, Pauline Grace Mercer. And then he stopped. His head turned, not fast. Just a slow rotation until he was looking directly at the observation window, directly at me. Victor Emmanuel Soto. I didn't move. Victor Emmanuel Soto, Decatur, Georgia. September 19th, 2010. My father's name. I stood there in that hallway, and I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Victor Emmanuel Soto wasn't in any file at Bryce Hospital. I'd never listed him on an employment form. I'd never mentioned him to anyone in Tuscaloosa. The accident had been 14 years ago, and I'd been in Atlanta when it happened, and I hadn't spoken his full name out loud in at least 5 years. Gregory's mouth closed. His head turned back to center. He went still again. I walked back to the admissions office, and I sat down at the desk, and I didn't do anything for a while. Then I started pulling records. I went through the Ward C incident reports first. 3 night shift staff had resigned without notice in the past 8 months. No exit interviews, no forwarding addresses on file. 1 orderly, Bobby Stevenson, had been found unresponsive in the laundry corridor on June 11th. Cause of death listed as cardiac event. No autopsy. Next of kin section was blank. I pulled the daily observation logs for Gregory's room. Food trays went in 3 times a day. Every tray came back empty. But the camera logs showed no one entering the room between meal drops. I checked the timestamps. The gaps were consistent. Anywhere from 8 to 14 minutes. The meal cart would appear in the hallway. Someone would unlock the door and slide the tray inside. The door would close. Then nothing. Then the door would open again and the tray would come out empty. I opened the camera archive on the desktop and pulled up Ward C footage for the past 2 months. 47 nights showed corrupted files. The video would play for a few seconds, then cut to static, then resume. The corrupted sections ranged from 6 minutes to almost an hour. I cross-referenced the dates with the observation logs. Every single corrupted file matched a night when Gregory had been logged as agitated. I sat back in the chair and looked at the screen. The fluorescent light was still clicking overhead. I picked up the phone and dialed the main line for Taylor Hardin Secure Medical Facility. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. Taylor Hardin, how can I direct your call? Admissions, please. There was a pause, then a click. The line rang twice. Admissions, this is Lexi Spencer. Hi, this is Lance Soto calling from Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa. I'm trying to verify a transfer we received earlier tonight. What's the case number? I read it off the intake form. There was silence on the other end. Not the kind of silence where someone's looking something up. The kind where someone's deciding what to say. 4 seconds. I counted them. We don't have any record of that patient being housed here. The transfer paperwork lists Taylor Hardin as the originating facility. I understand that, she said, but we have no record of housing that individual. Her voice was clipped. Careful. Can you double-check the case number? I don't need to double-check it, she said. That patient was never housed at this facility. Then where did the transfer come from? I can't help you with that. She hung up. I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear. Then I set it down and dialed the main line again. It rang 6 times, then it went to voicemail. You've reached Taylor Hardin Secure Medical Facility. Our office hours are 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. Please leave a message and we'll return your call during normal business hours. The voicemail didn't identify the facility by name, just said our office. I hung up and called back. Same voicemail. I tried a third time an hour later. Same thing. I pulled Gregory's intake form again and laid it flat on the desk. The case number was there. The court order was there. The deputy's signature was there. The diagnosing physician field had my initials in it. Nothing else. I'd signed my name at the bottom of the form. Standard procedure, the form was legal, filed correctly. But the physician field was blank except for my initials, and the facility listed on the transfer paperwork was denying they'd ever housed him. I looked at the clock. 4:37 a.m. I had a patient who knew my dead father's full name. A patient who recited deceased patients in order of death. A patient who'd been transferred from a facility that said he'd never been there. And I had a supervisor who told me not to query Taylor Hardin transfers. I sat there under the flickering fluorescent light, and I thought about the job offer I'd taken because I'd had no other options. I thought about the budget fraud investigation in Atlanta and the 3 months of savings I'd had left when I'd signed the contract. I thought about Morris's voice on the phone. Flat. Certain. Just initial the field and file the form. I'd done exactly that. The intake log was still sitting on Teresa Marsh's desk in the next room. I could see it through the doorway. My handwriting, my initials, my signature. The job that had felt like survival was starting to feel like something else. I didn't know what yet, but I knew I wasn't going to sleep when my shift ended. I made it through 2 more weeks without incident. That's not quite right. There were plenty of incidents. A patient in Ward B broke a window. Another one flooded the bathroom in the East Wing. Miranda Crane had to call security twice in one shift. But none of it involved Gregory, and none of it involved me standing in places I hadn't been. I kept my distance from Ward C. When I had to go in there, I signed the log, did my count, and left. I didn't linger. I didn't look through the observation windows longer than I had to. Gregory was still reciting names during the night checks, but I let the orderlies handle those. I stayed in the admissions office and processed intake forms and told myself that keeping my head down was the same thing as being smart. Ray Graham found me on a Thursday night, 21 days after Gregory had said my father's name. I was at my desk going through a transfer request from the county jail when I heard the knock. Light, 2 taps. I looked up and he was standing in the doorway with a manila folder in one hand. "You have a moment," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded and he came in and closed the door behind him. That was the first thing that told me this wasn't a social visit. Ray didn't close doors. He was the kind of person who left them open because he wanted you to know you could leave whenever you wanted. He set the folder on my desk, didn't open it, just rested his hand on the top of it and looked at me for a long moment. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to stay calm when you see it." I didn't say anything. My hands were still on the keyboard. I could feel my pulse in my thumbs. Ray opened the folder and took out a single sheet of paper. Glossy, 8.5 by 11. He turned it around and slid it across the desk. It was a security camera still, black and white, time-stamped in the corner. 2:47 a.m. The hallway in Ward C. I recognized the angle. Camera 3. Mounted above the nurse's station. There was a figure standing outside Gregory's door. I looked at it for a long time. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. The fluorescent light above my desk was buzzing, and I could hear someone laughing in the break room down the hall, and I could see my own hands resting on either side of the photograph. The figure in the picture was wearing my jacket, my badge, same height, same build, same haircut. "That's not me," I said. "I know," Ray said. I looked at the timestamp again. 2:47 a.m. I pulled my desk drawer open and took out the entry log from that night. I'd started keeping them after the first week. Habit from the budget job. Document everything. I flipped to the page and ran my finger down the column until I found the time. 2:47 a.m. I'd signed in at the admissions office. My handwriting, my initials. Teresa Marsh had countersigned it at 2:50 when she'd brought me a file from the locked cabinet. I held the log next to the photograph. "I was here," I said. "Teresa saw me." "I know," Ray said again. I set the log down, looked at the picture again. The figure's posture was wrong. Too stiff. Arms at its sides. I didn't stand that way. Nobody stood that way. And the shadow. I leaned closer. The hallway lights in Ward C ran in a line down the center of the ceiling. Fluorescent tubes. Standard issue. The shadow should have fallen straight down or maybe slightly to the left, depending on where the figure was standing. The shadow in the photograph fell to the right. Sharp angle. Like there was a light source low and to the left that didn't exist. "What is this?" I said. Ray pulled the chair out from the wall and sat down. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at me with that same calm expression he always had, the one that made you feel like he'd already thought about every question you were going to ask. "This has happened before," he said. 3 times in the past 2 years. A staff member appears in the Ward C footage at a time when they were documented elsewhere. Within a week, they stop coming to work. No notice, no calls, just gone. I looked at the photograph again. The figure's face was blurred, not from motion. The rest of the image was sharp, just the face. A smudge where features should have been. "Who were they?" I said. "An orderly named Marcus Webb, a night nurse named Stephanie Ruiz, a maintenance worker named Donald Pruitt." I recognized one of those names. Marcus Webb. That was the orderly Bobby Stevenson had replaced. The one Morris had mentioned during my first week. "Where did they go?" I said. "I don't know," Ray said. "Their families filed missing persons reports. Police found nothing. No activity on their bank accounts. No phone records. They just stopped existing." I pushed the photograph back across the desk. I didn't want to look at it anymore. "Why are you showing me this?" I said. "Because you need to know what's happening," Ray said. "And because you need to decide what you're going to do about it." I didn't say anything. I was thinking about Gregory's door, about standing there on night 3 with my hand on the frame, about the way he'd stopped mid-recitation and said my father's name. "It's him," I said. "Gregory, he's the anchor." Ray nodded slowly. "That's what I believe, yes. And it's using my face now." Yes. I sat back in my chair. The buzz from the fluorescent light was getting louder. Or maybe I was just noticing it more. What is it? I said. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, something that identifies people by their grief. By the weight they carry, it announces its selection by appearing in their image, in photographs, in reflections, in places they should not be. I thought about the Kebra Nagast on his desk. The conversation we'd had about entities that moved through names and images. You told me about this, I said. Weeks ago, I did. You knew this was going to happen. I knew it was possible, Ray said. You stood at Gregory's door. You engaged with him. That's how it begins. I looked at the photograph again, at the blurred face and the wrong shadow and the time stamp that proved I'd been somewhere else. What do I do? I said. Ray leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees. You leave, he said. Tonight, you don't come back. You don't tell anyone where you're going. You cut every tie to this place, and you hope that's enough. And if it's not, then it will follow you, Ray said. And it will find you, and you'll disappear the way the others did. I sat there under that buzzing light, and I thought about the job in Atlanta, about the budget fraud investigation and the way every door had closed, about the 3 months of savings and the contract I'd signed because I'd had no choice. I thought about running. Then I thought about the intake log sitting in Teresa Marsh's office, about my initials on Gregory's admission form, about the blank physician field I'd signed off on because Morris had told me to. I can't leave, I said. If I leave, I'm admitting I knew something was wrong. If they investigate Gregory's intake, I'm the one who signed it. I'm the one who's responsible. Ray looked at me for a long time. Then he stood up and picked up the folder. Then you need to be very careful, he said. And you need to watch Clyde Morris. Morris? Why? Because he's deteriorating, Ray said. Same pattern as the others. He's been wearing the same clothes for 3 days. He's been arriving late. And yesterday I heard him refer to Gregory by a name that doesn't appear in any file. I felt something cold settle in my chest. What name? I said. I don't know, Ray said. I couldn't make it out, but it wasn't Gregory. He walked to the door and opened it, paused with his hand on the frame. If you see him go into Ward C, Ray said, don't follow him. Then he left. I sat there alone with the photograph still on my desk. I didn't touch it. I just looked at the figure standing outside Gregory's door, at the shadow falling the wrong way, at the blurred space where a face should have been. I'd stood in that exact spot 21 days ago. Now something else was standing there, wearing my jacket. The next week moved slowly. I kept my head down, processed intake forms, signed logs, watched Morris. Ray was right. Morris was deteriorating. He showed up to work in the same shirt 3 nights in a row, stains on the collar, wrinkled. He'd always been sharp about his appearance. Now he looked like he'd slept in his car. He was late twice. Not by much, 10 minutes, 15. But Morris was never late. He was the kind of supervisor who showed up 30 minutes early and made you feel guilty for arriving on time. And he was forgetting things. Small things. He asked me for a file I'd already given him. He signed the same log twice. He stood in the hallway outside the admissions office, for almost a minute, just staring at the wall before he seemed to remember where he was going. On Tuesday night, I heard him talking to himself in the break room. I was walking past and the door was open and I heard his voice. Low, steady, like he was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I stopped and looked in. He was alone, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in front of him, staring at the far wall. His lips were moving. I didn't go in. I kept walking. At 1:15 a.m., I was at my desk when I heard the Ward C door open. The sound carried down the hallway, metal on metal, the latch clicking. I looked up, listened. No voices, no footsteps, just the door closing again. I pulled up the entry log on my desk. The physical one. The paper sheet we still used because the digital system was unreliable. Morris hadn't signed in. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to decide if it mattered, trying to decide if I should go check. Then I remembered what Ray had said. If you see him go into Ward C, don't follow him. I looked at the clock. 1:16 a.m. I stayed at my desk. At 1:20, I got up. I told myself I was just going to check the log, make sure it was a mistake. Maybe someone else had gone in. Maybe I'd misheard. I walked down the hallway, slow. The fluorescent lights overhead were flickering. One of them was out completely. The hallway felt darker than usual. The Ward C door was closed. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The lights were on, bright. The nurse's station was empty. Miranda Crane was probably doing her rounds in the East Wing. I looked down the corridor, counted the doors. Gregory's room was fourth on the left. Clyde Morris was standing in front of it, both palms flat against the door, head tilted forward, eyes open. I stopped walking. "Morris," I said. He didn't move. I said his name again, louder. Nothing. I walked closer, slow. My shoes squeaked on the linoleum, and the sound echoed off the walls. When I got within 10 feet, I stopped. Morris's eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking. His mouth was slightly open. His breath was fogging the observation window. "Clyde," I said. His fingers twitched, just once. Then they went still again. I looked at the observation window. Gregory was sitting on his bed, facing the door, hands folded in his lap. He was looking directly at Morris. I took a step back. Morris's lips moved. No sound, just the shape of words I couldn't hear. I turned and walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the phone, dialed security. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Yeah, this is Soto in Ward C. I need someone down here now." "What's the situation?" "Clyde Morris is unresponsive. He's standing outside a patient's room, and he's not responding to verbal cues." There was a pause. Then, "On our way." I hung up and looked back down the corridor. Morris was still standing there. Same position. Palms flat. Eyes open. I didn't go any closer. Security arrived 6 minutes later. 2 guys I recognized. One of them was named Tim. I didn't know the other one's name. I pointed down the corridor and they walked past me. I stayed at the nurse's station. Tim said something to Morris. I couldn't hear what. Then he reached out and touched Morris's shoulder. Morris collapsed. Not slow, not a stumble. He just dropped. Straight down, like someone had cut his strings. Tim caught him before he hit the floor, lowered him the rest of the way. The other security guy was already on his radio calling for medical. I stayed where I was. Miranda Crane showed up 8 minutes later with a med kit. She knelt next to Morris and checked his pulse, shined a light in his eyes, asked him questions he didn't answer. They got him onto a gurney and wheeled him out. Miranda went with them. Tim stayed behind to file the incident report. I told him what I'd seen. He wrote it down. Asked me if Morris had said anything. I said no. Tim looked at me for a moment, then he said, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded and left. I stood there alone in the Ward C corridor. The lights were still buzzing. The air smelled like disinfectant and something else, something sour. I looked down at Gregory's door. The observation window was dark. I couldn't see inside. I turned around and walked back to the admissions office. At 4 a.m., I got the call. Miranda Crane had been found in the Ward C corridor. Broken wrist, laceration across her throat. Not deep enough to be fatal, but deep enough to need stitches. She was conscious, talking, but she wasn't making sense. I went down there. Security was already on site. So was the night supervisor from the East Wing. Miranda was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. Her wrist was wrapped. There was blood on her scrubs. She was saying something over and over, same phrase. I didn't recognize the language. The supervisor looked at me. "You know what that is?" I shook my head. Ray Graham arrived 10 minutes later. I didn't know who'd called him. Maybe nobody. Maybe he just knew. He knelt next to Miranda and listened. Then he looked up at me. "It's Ge'ez," he said. "An old Ethiopian language." "What's she saying?" the supervisor asked. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's asking for help." Miranda kept repeating it. Same phrase, same rhythm. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at anything. I walked back to the nurse's station and pulled up the Ward C camera footage. Found the timestamp, 4 a.m. I hit play. The corridor was empty. I watched the timestamp run. 4 o'clock, 4:01, 4:02. The hallway stayed empty. At 4:11, security appeared on camera. Running, then the night supervisor, then me. I rewound it, watched it again. 11 minutes of empty hallway. Miranda had been attacked during those 11 minutes. I looked at the monitor, at the empty corridor, at the timestamp running in the corner. Then I looked down the hall toward Gregory's door. Clyde Morris had been standing there less than 3 hours ago. Palms flat, eyes open, unresponsive. Now Miranda was on the floor repeating words in a language she didn't speak, and the camera had recorded nothing. I thought about the photograph Ray had shown me, the figure wearing my jacket, the shadow falling the wrong way. I thought about Morris's deterioration, the same clothes, the late arrivals, the name he'd used for Gregory that didn't appear in any file. Morris was already gone. Whatever had been standing at that door hadn't been Clyde Morris anymore, and I had stood at that same door 21 days ago. I was next. I looked at the empty hallway on the monitor, at the timestamp still running. I understood then, completely. Gregory was the anchor, the fixed point it returned to, and it moved through whoever had stood closest to his door, wearing their face, using their name. It had used Morris. Now Morris was overwritten. And I was next in the sequence. I sat there in the nurse's station, with the camera footage looping on the screen, And I thought about the 3 staff members who disappeared, about the missing persons reports and the empty bank accounts and the families who'd never gotten answers. I thought about running, but I'd already signed the intake form, already initialed the blank physician field, already tied myself to Gregory in a way that couldn't be undone. The fluorescent light above me was buzzing. I could hear Miranda still repeating that phrase down the hall. I looked at the monitor one more time. The hallway was empty, but I knew something had been there, and I knew it was coming for me next. I left the nurse's station and walked to the admissions office. The hallway was empty. My shoes made that squeaking sound on the linoleum. I could still hear Miranda down in Ward C, repeating that phrase. The fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead. The admissions office door was unlocked. It always was during night shift. I stepped inside and closed it behind me. The blank intake forms were in a filing cabinet next to Teresa's desk. I pulled one out. The paper was pale yellow, pre-printed with fields and signature lines. Patient name, admitting diagnosis, physician signature, coordinator initials. I sat down at Teresa's desk and clicked the pen. I wrote a false name in the patient field, something generic, Michael Thompson. Then I wrote Clyde Morris's name on the patient's signature line. My hand was steady. I'd watched Morris sign his name probably 50 times in the past 3 weeks. The slant was easy to copy. In the admitting coordinator field, I signed my own name. That was it. Morris was now a patient, admitted by me, under a name that didn't match his ID or his employment record or anything else in the system. But the form was valid. It had my signature. It had his. And no one would question a night admission for at least 3 days, because that's how long it took for Teresa to cross-reference the logs with the digital system. I folded the form and slipped it into the filing tray, where incoming admissions sat before processing. It would be logged tomorrow morning. By then I'd be gone. I stood up and looked at Teresa's desk. The paper intake log was sitting right there, right where she always left it. A spiral-bound notebook with blue lines and a cardstock cover. Every night shift coordinator signed in when they arrived and signed out when they left. Timestamps, names, initials, a full record of who was in the building and when. Tonight's log had my signature at the top. Arrival time, 10:43 p.m. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. The pages were thick. There were probably 2 years' worth of entries in there. Maybe more. I flipped through it. Names I didn't recognize. Dates going back to late 2021. The handwriting changed every few pages. Different coordinators, different shifts. I closed it and held it under my arm. Then I walked out of the office. The hallway was still empty. I passed the break room, past the nurse's station, past Ward C. I didn't look inside. I could still hear Miranda, faint now, like she was farther away than she should have been. I kept walking. The supply room was at the end of the east corridor. It wasn't locked either. Most of the doors in this place weren't locked. Budget cuts, probably, or just neglect. I stepped inside and turned on the light. The room was narrow. Shelves on both sides. Cleaning supplies. Boxes of gloves. Stacks of patient gowns still in plastic. And in the back corner, on the bottom shelf, a cardboard box labeled Unclaimed Personal Effects. I knelt down and opened it. There wasn't much inside. A wallet with no cash, a watch with a cracked face, a set of keys, and a lighter. Silver, scratched up. The kind you refill with fluid. It had belonged to Bobby Stevenson, the orderly who'd been found unresponsive in the laundry corridor 8 months ago, logged as cardiac. No family had come to collect his things. The box had been sitting here ever since. I took the lighter and stood up. Then I walked back down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the break room, and out the side door that led to the parking lot. The air outside was cold. It was almost 4:30 in the morning. The sky was still dark. The parking lot lights were buzzing. There were maybe 6 cars out here. Mine was the furthest one out, a gray Honda with a dent in the passenger door. I walked to the middle of the lot, under one of the lights, and stopped. I set the intake log on the pavement. Then I flipped it open. The pages were stiff. They didn't want to stay flat. I knelt down and held the lighter to the corner of the first page. It took 3 tries to get it lit. The flame was small, yellow. It caught the edge of the paper and spread slowly at first, then faster. The pages curled as they burned. The ink turned black, then gray, then disappeared. The smell was sharp, chemical. I stayed there and watched it. It took less than 2 minutes. When it was done, there was just ash, black flakes on the pavement. I stepped on them and ground them under my shoe until there was nothing left but a dark smudge. I stood there for a minute, maybe longer. I understood what I'd just done. The log was the only document placing me at the hospital before the attack on Miranda. Without it, my arrival time was unverifiable. I wasn't a provable witness. I could say I'd shown up after the attack. I could say I'd never been in Ward C. There was no record to contradict me, but the cost was immediate. Gregory's original intake form still existed. The one I'd initialed on night 3. The one with the blank physician field. That form made me legally responsible for an admission with no physician signature. And now I'd destroyed the only document that might have proven I hadn't known what I was signing, that I'd just been following procedure, that I'd been told not to query Taylor-Hardin transfers. I'd traded one liability for another, and I'd made sure Clyde Morris wouldn't be able to tell anyone what he'd seen. Morris was admitted now, under a false name, on a form I'd signed. He'd be questioned eventually, but not for 3 days, maybe longer, and by then whatever was overriding him would be too far gone for anyone to believe what he said. He'd witnessed enough to implicate me. He'd stood at Gregory's door. He'd heard the names. He'd seen the footage. But I'd made certain he wouldn't have the opportunity to say so. I looked down at the smudge on the pavement. Then I looked up at the hospital. The lights were still on in Ward C. I could see the window from here. Just a faint glow behind the glass. I turned and walked to my car. The Honda started on the second try. I pulled out of the parking lot and turned north onto 15th Street. Then I got onto US 82 and kept driving. The road was empty. No other cars, no lights except the ones on the highway. I passed the city limits, past the turnoff for Northport, past the exit for the state forest. I didn't look back. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and I drove north. I reached Birmingham around 4 in the morning. The highway had been empty the whole way. No other cars. Just me and the white lines and the dark pressing in on both sides. I pulled off at the first exit on the north side of the city. There was a gas station at the end of the ramp, one of those old ones that hadn't been updated since the 90s. Single island, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The kind of place that probably got robbed twice a year. I parked near the edge of the lot, not by the pumps, just off to the side where the pavement turned to gravel. The payphone was on the exterior wall. I could see it from the car. Metal box. Scratched plastic shield. Receiver hanging on a cord that looked like it had been there since installation. I sat in the Honda for a minute. Maybe two. The engine ticked as it cooled. I'd driven this far without thinking about what came next. Just north. Just away. But now I was here, and the phone was right there, and I had to decide if I was going to do this. I got out of the car. The air was cooler up here. Not by much. But enough that I noticed. I walked across the gravel and stopped in front of the phone. There was a number written in marker on the metal box. Someone's failed attempt at advertising. Below it, someone else had scratched initials into the paint. I lifted the receiver. It smelled like old plastic and cigarette smoke. I held it against my ear and listened to the dial tone for a few seconds. Then I fed coins into the slot. 4 quarters. The machine took them one at a time. I didn't need to look the number up. I knew it. Had known it for years. Edwin's cell. Same number he'd had since college. He never changed it. Said it was easier to keep one number than to tell everyone when it switched. I dialed. It rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, he picked up. Hello? His voice was rough, sleep thick. I'd woken him up. Of course I had. It was past 4 in the morning. I didn't say anything. Hello? He said again. A little louder this time, a little more awake. I stood there with the receiver pressed to my ear and listened to him breathe on the other end. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Who is this? I could hear him shifting. Probably sitting up in bed. Probably looking at the screen to see if the number showed up. It wouldn't. Payphones didn't work that way. If this is some kind of... I hung up. The receiver clicked back into place. The dial tone returned. I stood there staring at the phone for a long time. That was it. I'd confirmed the number, confirmed he still had it, confirmed he was alive and reachable, and that the connection between us still existed, even if we hadn't spoken in 3 years. Ray Graham had told me about this. Not directly, not in those words, but he'd explained it when I asked about the Quebra Nagast, about the thing that moved through Bryce. He'd said it tracked people through unresolved grief, that it followed names, that it found you through the people you loved and hadn't let go of. I'd asked him how it chose, how it knew who to follow. He'd looked at me for a long time before answering. Then he'd said, "It doesn't choose. You do. The moment you reach for someone in the dark, you tell it where to go next." I'd thought about that a lot in the weeks after, about what it meant, about whether it was true. Now I knew. The call wasn't for comfort, wasn't to hear Edwin's voice or to tell him what had happened or to ask for help. I couldn't do any of that. Couldn't explain what I'd done. Couldn't put him in a position where he'd have to decide whether to believe me. But I also couldn't carry the weight of being completely alone, not on that highway, not in the dark, not with the knowledge of what I'd just done sitting in my chest like a stone. So I'd called. I'd confirmed a name. I'd confirmed a living connection. And I'd handed the thing at Bryce a new point of entry. I understood this. I had understood it before I picked up the receiver. And I'd done it anyway, because the grief of being alone, really alone, with no one left who remembered who I'd been before Atlanta, before the fraud investigation, before I'd signed that contract in Tuscaloosa, was the one weight I couldn't carry without it becoming the thing that made me findable. Ray Graham had been right. You choose, you reach, and the moment you do, you've already told it where to go. I walked back to the car. My hands were shaking a little, not much, just enough that I noticed when I pulled the door handle. I sat in the driver's seat and looked out at the gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A truck pulled in on the far side of the island. The driver got out and started filling the tank. He didn't look over. I thought about Edwin, about the last time we'd spoken. It had been at a family thing, cousin's wedding, Decatur. He'd asked what I was doing for work, and I'd said something vague about hospital administration. He'd nodded and changed the subject. That was it. We didn't talk about the investigation. Didn't talk about why I'd left Atlanta. Didn't talk about Dad. We never talked about Dad. That was the unresolved part. The grief Ray Graham had been talking about. Not that Dad was dead. That was 14 years gone. But that Edwin and I had never figured out what to do with the fact that we'd both been in the car that night, that we'd both walked away, that neither of us had ever said out loud what we were thinking. I looked at the payphone. It was maybe 30 feet away. The receiver hung crooked on the cord. The thing at Bryce had Gregory's name. It had Clyde Morris's name now too, probably. And it had mine. I'd stood outside Gregory's door on night 3. I'd put my name in the log. I'd initialed the blank physician field. I'd signed the intake form that put Morris in a room under a false identity. Every decision I'd made had been about survival, about not getting caught, about keeping my head down and staying out of the line of fire. And every single one of them had just confirmed what Ray Graham had already known, that the thing didn't need to hunt. It just waited for you to reach for someone, to prove you still had something left to lose. Now it had Edwin's number. It had his name. It had the fact that I'd called him at 4 a.m. and said nothing and hung up. That was enough. I started the car. The Honda turned over on the first try this time. I pulled out of the gravel lot and back onto the access road. Then I merged onto the highway and kept driving north. The payphone got smaller in the rearview mirror. Then it was gone. I didn't know where I was going. Didn't have a plan past Birmingham, maybe Nashville, maybe further. It didn't really matter. I was legally exposed now. The intake log was gone, but the form with my signature was still in the system. The blank physician field was still there. Miranda Crane's injury was still documented. Clyde Morris was still admitted under a name I'd written. Professionally, I was finished. There was no version of this where I came out clean. And the thing at Bryce, whatever it was, whatever Ray Graham's text had called it, had a new name to follow. A brother I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. A connection I'd just confirmed was still live. I'd made the call knowing what it would cost. I'd done it anyway, because the decision that had started everything, initialing a blank field to avoid scrutiny, choosing survival over procedure, had just completed its arc. I'd traded Edwin's safety for one more night of not being alone in the dark. That was the weight. Not the fraud investigation, not the intake form, not even Gregory, just the fact that when it came down to it, I'd chosen myself. Again, the highway stretched out ahead, empty, dark, no other cars. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and I drove north.